Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, New Rules, New Risks, Latest Cybersecurity and Data Protection Impacts on Product Compliance. So as always, I'll just give a little bit of orientation about the webinar platform before I introduce our speaker for today. The webinar slides are available to the left side of your screen, along with a few helpful links if you would like to explore more and learn about how compliance and risks can help simplify and accelerate your compliance processes. And as always, we want this webinar to be as engaging as possible, so please do send us any questions you may have, and we'll aim to address them during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And if you would like to submit a question for the session, please use the Ask a Question widget on the left side of your screen. And we'll follow up with you directly for any questions that we don't get to during today's session. At any time, if you're interested in having a member of the compliance and risks team follow up with you outside of asking a question, please don't hesitate as well to use the Start a Conversation button at the bottom of your screen. And last but not least, the webinar recording and slides will be available to you within 24 hours. My name is Orla Morris, and I'm the Content Marketing Manager here at Compliance and Risks, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Ashley Weeks, who is a Senior Regulatory Consultant at RINA, with a strong technical background in industry product legislation. Ashley has expertise in CE marking directives and regulations, and UK equivalents such as EMCD, LVD, RED, machinery, and many others. Ashley provides advice to economic operators, including manufacturers, importers, and distributors, to help them understand their specific product legislation requirements related to their products. He also has cooperation with government departments, such as the Department for Business and Trade, communicating feedback from many SMEs to allow the relevant departments to ensure any updates to legislation are communicated in the clearest way possible. Prior to joining RINA, Ashley also has years of experience in the EMC world, originally working as a test engineer in different industries such as military, aerospace, automotive, and commercial. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ashley. And just before I pass you over to Ashley, I would like to provide a quick background about compliance and risks for those who are joining the series for the first time. At Compliance and Risks, our mission is to help ensure global companies have the tools and information to build safe, sustainable products in a world full of change. And we are the trusted product compliance technology provider for some of the world's leading brands, having spent 2 decades honing the digital tools, expertise, and content you need to stay ahead of the dynamic regulatory landscape and prove your product's compliance, protecting your brands, and helping to drive your growth. At Compliance and Risks, we have the world's most comprehensive regulatory database with over 100,000 regulations historically available in C2P, with a global regulatory coverage and expertise across over 10 industries. We definitely understand that regulatory compliance doesn't sleep. And our regulatory expert team is truly global, with 28 languages collectively spoken across the team, all fortified by our 30 knowledge partners. And as mentioned, C2P is our enterprise software designed to keep global organizations on top of regulatory changes and their impact worldwide. And this includes early warning alerts, impact probability, productivity workflow tools, and so much more. And with that, I'm delighted to finally pass it over to you, Ashley.
Thank you very much, Ola. Much appreciated. So I'm just going to give us a very quick overview of the organisation that I'm here on behalf of, which is RINA. So our headquarters is in Genoa, in Italy, and we were originally an Italian maritime company set up in 1861. Over a long period of history, we entered into the industrial field, and eventually we morphed into a joint stock company, becoming a global leader in testing, inspection, certification, and engineering solutions across a wide range of markets. They include marine, energy, real estate, infrastructure, mobility, and space and defence. We have around 6,000 global experts in more than 70 countries, and we partner with clients across many industries trying to deliver safety, sustainability, and regulatory compliance solutions worldwide. More specifically within RINA, I'm actually here as part of the RINA regulatory compliance team, and we are a team of 11 regulatory experts. We support authorities, manufacturers, importers, and distributors of products, and we help them identify, understand, and meet their technical and environmental legislative requirements. We're based in a place called Leatherhead, which is in Surrey in the United Kingdom, and we come from various backgrounds. We have chemists, material scientists, food contact specialists, across a range of different sectors, and we also operate in different jurisdictions. We offer support for global market access. We're predominantly based in the UK and Europe, but we do have clients who wish to gain access in North America, East Asia, South America, the Gulf states, etc. More specifically today, we're looking really at the core principles of cybersecurity legislation in relation to product compliance, and these are the webinar objectives. The overriding objective is why cybersecurity is a regulatory priority and how jurisdictions are responding through legislation. We're going to break that down slightly, so we're going to have a look at what is happening in the UK, and we're going to have an overview of the UK PSTI Act, Product Security and Telecommunications Infrastructure Act and Regulations, which came into force last year. We're going to look at what's happening in Europe, so an introduction to the EU Cyber Resilience Act and the newly established RED cybersecurity requirements. We're going to look at relationships with other union legislation where applicable. So we will look if there's overlaps and synergy with ever-evolving directives and regulations. We're going to have a look at how cybersecurity requirements increasingly align with core and key data protection principles. And finally, we'll try and establish whether processes are working. So as the legislation is developing, are manufacturers complying with some of the requirements that are now mandatory? Just as a little bit of a background, I don't think I'll be surprising anybody here reeling off some of the stats and statistics with regards to cyber attacks. I'm sure we're all aware that cyber attacks are on the rise globally and it's affecting us all. Going back to 2024, in the first 6 months, there was a 23% increase in global cyber attacks with an average of 9 serious incidents per day. In the first half of that year, that equated to over 1,600 serious cyber attacks counted globally. Increases up from 2023 and up from all the way from 2019, it's virtually doubled. Most of the attacks were concentrated in the Americas, which equated to 41% of all serious cybersecurity attacks, and Europe with 29%. The latter, however, is seeing a significant increase in recent years, which might make today's presentation specifically relevant. It's also escalated, as I'm sure we're aware, by geopolitical conflicts that increasingly aim to try and destabilize digital infrastructures, exposing essential data and services to serious risks. And in terms of key sectors impacted, historically the manufacturing sector has been the hardest hit. However, healthcare is rapidly catching up, where there's been an increase by 83% since 2023 alone in the health data security of thousands of citizens. We could probably give countless real-life examples of cybersecurity attacks. We see or read the news, we see them virtually now on the news on a weekly basis. However, on Cybersecurity 16, there was something called a distributed denial of service attack, a DDoS attack, and this is a cybercrime accessing connected online services and sites. As we can imagine, for an organisation, an unavailable website can have a significant impact on an organisation's productivity, which could include loss of sales or employees unable to work. It doesn't even matter if this case is temporary or if no data confidentiality or integrity has been compromised. It will affect all. In 2016, cyber criminals used thousands of compromised connectable products to launch a distributed denial of service such as the BBC and Netflix, as well as leaving much of the internet inaccessible across the US East Coast. Apologies, I believe the audio was slightly breaking up there. Hopefully that's come back in. Moving into why it's still a concern. So IoT devices are on the rise. The number of IoT devices worldwide is forecast to almost double from around 16 billion to 32 billion by the end of this decade. Recent studies have suggested that the average UK household had 9 consumer connectable products in their home, with many lacking basic cybersecurity protections. In terms of why they happen, according to a study by the IBM, estimated that 95% of cyber attacks actually succeed because of human error. This can include active errors, such as opening malicious email attachments, and passive errors, such as using weak passwords. The consumer charity Which found that the popular smart tech products that we might assume are compliant on the market from leading brands, for example, the Ring doorbell and the Amazon Echo Dot, were deemed easily hackable. One of the key reasons for this was determined to be a lack of support to be an issue. The survey found that often products would lose manufacturer security support after 2 years, despite having a much longer shelf life. All this leads to, fortunately or unfortunately, the way that we may look at things, but it leads to more regulations. So I'm sure we're all aware that regulators are responding to the threat, and certain jurisdictions are acting at different speeds. This can lead to regulatory divergence, which can cause headaches for economic operators. A key takeaway that we may see from today is that the UK moved before the EU in relation to product cybersecurity legislation. And this is one of the rare instances in a post-Brexit world where we've seen the UK act before Europe. So starting with looking at the UK PSTI, and that's not the PTSI, that's the PSTI, which stands for the Product Security and Telecommunications Infrastructure Act and Regulations. And this came into effect on the 29th of April 2024. So it came into force over a year ago now, so people hopefully are familiar with the regulation. To give a little bit of background, the UK government created its Code of Practice for Consumer IoT Security all the way back in 2018. These were a voluntary set of guidelines which were describing the security measures that manufacturers of consumer connected products were required to implement. The UK government sought international consensus. They found it with countries such as Australia and India, who both published their own code of practices which were consistent with the 13 principles of the UK's version. However, the intentions were good, but they were voluntary guidelines. Manufacturers were deemed to still not be securing their products adequately, so it was decided that the mandatory legislation would be required, and so came the UK PSTI. The core aim really is to provide a baseline set of security requirements for IoT devices who sell to UK consumers. And the key point here is consumers. Products that fall within scope of the PSTI are defined as relevant connectable products, or RCPs. They can be defined as products which are internet connectable or products which are network connectable. And to go a little bit further on those definitions here, we can see internet connectable products are simply devices which are capable of sending and receiving data over the global internet using standard protocols, for example, TCP or IP, via Wi-Fi, Ethernet, or cellular networks. These are often our smart products that we see around the house, whether that's smart TVs, smartphones, voice-activated assistants such as the Amazon Echo, connected thermostats, smart speakers, or home alarm systems. Hopefully that's a relatively straightforward definition. Where things get slightly more confusing is in the second definition, which is related to network connectable products. Essentially here, what we mean are products that do not directly connect to the internet, but they can connect to other devices that do, either directly or as part of a local network. So the first condition for the regulation states two conditions that must be met here. One of the two must be met to fall underneath the definition of a network connectable product. The first one is a product that can connect directly to an internet connected device using an internet protocol based method. So for example, it could be a smart home hub that connects via Wi-Fi to a smart speaker which is connected to the internet. Another example might be the Amazon Echo Dot, which once again connects over Wi-Fi to a router, which is then connected to the internet, even though the product doesn't directly connect to the internet. The second condition is the product can connect to two or more devices using a non-IP protocol, for example, Bluetooth or Zigbee, and at least one of those devices must be internet connected, even indirectly. So for example, here we could be a Bluetooth fitness tracker that syncs with your phone and a smartwatch. Your phone is internet connected, so the tracker qualifies. Another example might be a Bluetooth speaker, which can pair over Bluetooth with two gadgets at the same time. And one of those devices can be an internet connected phone. Essentially, the second connectability example is to ensure that devices that talk locally to more than one device at a time can still use a local link which to at least one device that's already on the internet. It is a threat to cybersecurity also. It exists because the network connectable definition really tries to catch any offline gadgets that hands data to an internet-enabled hub, ensuring these local-only devices also meet the baseline security requirements and can't be used as a backdoor as entry into our networks. The PSTI has a list of accepted connectable products that are similar in principle to European directives and regulation exclusions. And generally speaking, it's where other legislation takes priority. The UK government wants to avoid dual regulations. So here, products which are made available for supply in Northern Ireland in a single market where relevant legislation applies will be out of scope of the UK PSTI. Also, charge points for electric vehicles are dealt with by the electric vehicles regulations. Medical devices are still dealt with by the UK medical devices regulation. Smart meter products are subject to the relevant energy license conditions. And desktops, laptop computers and tablets which do not have cellular connectivity, unless specifically designed for children, are also out of scope. Now, the UK government did a call for views a few years ago, and it highlighted that manufacturers of desktop and laptop computers would face unique challenges due to the complexities of their supply chains. Essentially, I think they're also saying that they don't deem these products to be consumer products and use more in a business orientation. In terms of who has to comply, well, the Act sets out the duties of relevant persons in similar ways to how European directives and regulations lay out obligations of economic operators. So as expected, the majority of the obligations will fall on the manufacturer, who must ensure that the products that are placed on the market have met the minimum security requirements, which we'll look at a moment. The manufacturer has a number of duties placed upon them. So a duty to investigate potential compliance failures, duties to take action in relation to compliance failures, duties to maintain records, which must be kept for over 10 years or for a defined support period, whichever is deemed longer, and a duty to raise a statement of compliance. Importers and distributors also have duties placed upon them to not make a product available unless it has a statement of compliance with the product and proof of meeting those minimum security requirements. Essentially speaking, they have due diligence obligations and need to ensure that they do not make a product available to consumers if they deem them to be non-compliant. If they do deem them to be non-compliant, they have an obligation to notify enforcement authorities, such as the UK OPSS. An importer also has an obligation to keep a copy of that statement of compliance for, once again, a period of 10 years or a defined support period, whichever is deemed longer. So the UK PSTI Act lays down three minimum security requirements, and we've mentioned this before, but they're essentially three provisions of the ETSI EN 303645, and this is a European standard for cybersecurity in consumer IoT devices. If you comply with these three provisions, you will meet these requirements. But they are, quite simply, number one, banning universal default and easily guessable passwords. So passwords have to be unique per product. They can't be based on incremental counters or based on publicly available information. There needs to be an obligation to publish information on how to report security issues. So here, the manufacturer shall make a vulnerability disclosure policy publicly available. Essentially, this needs to ensure that there is one point of contact to allow a person to report these security issues. It has to be free of charge. They must acknowledge and offer status updates until the resolution has been resolved. And finally, there's an obligation to publish information on minimum security update periods. The defined support period must be published. If it changes or it's extended, it shall be defined as soon as practicable. So what to expect, and this is just a summary of what to expect to see with products that are compliant with the UK PSTI. And as stated previously, it needs to be accompanied by a statement of compliance as per Schedule 4 of the PSTI regulations. So the statement of compliance is similar in principle to EU declarations of conformities. that those of us who are familiar with. That includes the name and address of the manufacturer of the products, and proof that it complies with the minimum 3 security requirements. However, it's a separate document, so this has to accompany the product accordingly. Just a point of note, the PSTI doesn't mandate the requirement to affix labels. So for those that may expect to see the UKCA label, for example, this is not a requirement. Do not expect to see it as evidence of compliance with the UK PSTI. Moving on into Europe and the European Cyber Resilience Act, the CRA. So this was published in the official journal on November 2024, but as we'll see, lots of the obligations are not yet enforced and won't come into force until a later date, so there is a little bit of time to prepare. But essentially, the Cyber Resilience Act is there to complement the existing EU legislative framework. So existing legislation should only really partially address some of the identified security problems across the Union. The aim here is to fill those gaps, clarify links, and make the framework more coherent, ensuring that all products with digital components, for example, IoT products that we've already looked at, are made secure throughout the supply chain and throughout their entire life cycle. Scope applies to products with digital elements, or PDEs, whose intended or reasonably foreseeable use includes a direct or indirect logical physical data connection to a device or to a network. This is a wide scope. It's a much wider scope than what we've seen in the UK PSTI. It's to a network or a device. So if your product contains any digital element, for example, microchips, firmware, sensors, software, and it connects directly to another device or network via Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, USB, or cloud, then it will fall under the EU Cyber Resilience Act. We could look at examples. It could be end devices such as laptops, software such as mobile banking apps, components such as central processing units, all can fall within scope depending on how they are placed on the market. Similarly to the UK PSTI and other EU directives and regulations, exclusions do exist. So the regulation proposes the following exclusions, and PDEs which are covered by the medical devices or the in vitro diagnostic medical devices regulations are out of scope. PDEs which are covered by the motor vehicles regulation are also out of scope, as are products certified in accordance with civil aviation. Equipment that falls within scope of the Marine Equipment Directive also falls out of scope, and as are PDEs which are developed exclusively, and the key there is exclusively, for national security or military purposes. That exclusion would not be there if it was for dual use. Spare parts made available to replace identical components in PDEs are also excluded, as is also software as a service, but software as a product is not. So the EU CRA takes the view of a classification of products, and the classification of products dictate the conformity assessment procedures, i.e. which route you have to take to comply with the requirements of the regulation. So the conformity assessment procedure will be determined by a classification product which falls into a conformity assessment procedure, and more stringent requirements will be there for higher risk products. Looking at non-critical products here, that's manufacturers with products in the non-critical category, you can go down the self-assessment route to demonstrate compliance with the CRA essential requirements. There's no obligation to adopt any specific harmonised standards, providing you can prove that you comply with the essential requirements, you meet the EU Cyber Resilience Act essential requirements in Annex 1. This will apply to the majority of products that are likely to fall within scope of the EU CRA. So majority of consumer products, smart home devices, printers, Bluetooth speakers that we've looked at will fall within this category. However, moving into more stringent categories, the first one we have is important class 1. And these are products or PDEs that perform functions which are critical to the cybersecurity of other products. The regulation references standalone and embedded browsers, password managers, products with VPN functions, and network management systems. There's still an option to go down the self-assessment route for products within this category. However, you need to apply a harmonised standard in full. You can also apply a European Cybersecurity Certification Scheme, and I'll touch upon that in a moment. Moving to important classification 2, and these are PDEs that perform a function which carry a significant risk in terms of its ability to disrupt, control, or cause damage to a large number of other products. And products in this category must complete a third-party conformity assessment, or once again, use a European cybersecurity certification scheme. In this instance, the regulation gives examples of firewalls, intrusion detection and prevention systems. And finally, moving into the critical classifications, which is defined as products that could lead to serious disruptions of critical supply chains across the internal market. And this is examples given are hardware devices with security boxes, smart meter gateways, or smart cards or similar devices. In this instance, products in these critical classifications must complete a European Commons Criteria certification assessment conducted by a conformity assessment body. Now, these the wheels are in motion on these schemes. They're created by ENISA underneath the European Cybersecurity Act. And this is essentially specific certifications with a defined scope and a method for complying that certain products will fall within, critical products will fall within scope of. I believe there's 3 currently there on the ENISA website. If you do not have one created that your product falls within scope of, then you can revert back a step. So in that instance, for example, you may feel that you meet the definition of a critical classification and you meet one of the examples given in the regulation. But if a certification scheme has not yet been created, you would revert back to the important Class 2 conformity assessment procedure, and you would go down the route of a notified body assessment. It's important to note that important and critical category lists are going to be amended over time via delegated acts. So this will be something that will be changing in due course. I spoke about the essential requirements before. So the CRA provides a basic set of essential requirements in Annex 1 of the CRA Act. These include a risk assessment, which is to be performed during development stage, be made on the market without known vulnerabilities, ensure that vulnerabilities can be assessed through security updates, ensure that you can protect the confidentiality of stored data, draw up a software bill of materials, be designed, developed and produced to limit attack surfaces, and finally put in place and enforce a policy on a coordinated vulnerability disclosure. So similar to the UK PSTI, a vulnerability disclosure policy must be in place. The Commission will issue standardisation requests, so it will allow European standardisation organised to develop technical standards for many of the product categories covered by the Act, and similar to other EU directives, compliance with harmonised standards under the official journal will offer a presumption of conformity with the essential requirements, providing you fall within that specific category. So different requirements apply to economic operators in a similar principle to the UK PSTI and relevant persons. So manufacturers will have due diligence obligations for third-party components incorporated into their products. They'll need to define support periods. They'll need to draw up the relevant technical documentation similar with other EU directives and regulations. They'll need to provide relevant information and instructions. They need to supply a DOC, but this can be a simplified version similar to the Radio Equipment Directive, so the short version that redirects to a website. And this is a CE marking directive, so there's a requirement to affix CE marking. There's also an obligation to report known vulnerabilities, which will be established by ENISA, and they will create their own reporting template. Importers and distributors generally have due diligence obligations. They have to ensure these essential requirements have been met. They also have to ensure that the correct conformity assessment procedure has been followed that we've just spoken about. They have an obligation to inform manufacturers of vulnerabilities. And importers also have an additional obligation to ensure that their details are provided on the packaging or in an accompanying product with the digital elements. We can see the timeline here. So as I said earlier on, the EU CRA was published in the official journal in November 2024, and it entered into force 20 days after that date. What that means really is the application of the regulation really comes into force in December 2027. There are some caveats to that. So there's notified bodies, so member states have an obligation to notify the Commission and other member states of notified bodies authorised to carry out conformity assessments, and this is needed by June 2026. And the Commission really wants to avoid bottlenecks and hindrances to market entry. And also reporting obligations will kickstart from September 2026. So manufacturers shall report vulnerabilities onto a single reporting platform, which will be established by ENISA. and that will, like I said, will happen from September 2026. Penalties exist, so penalties for infringements will lie with individual member states. However, the regulation sets onerous administrative fines starting from 5 million and can result in much larger fines. In terms of the relationship with other union legislation, so the NIS2 directive, another new framework that has been upgraded recently, provides a common level of cybersecurity in 18 critical and important sectors such as energy, transport, healthcare, finance, and water management, etc. The theory is that the more products which are compliant with the EU Cyber Resilience Act will facilitate the compliance by the entities in the scope of the NIS2 directive and would strengthen the security of the entire supply chain. Hopefully that logical approach makes sense to everybody. There's also the EU Cybersecurity Act, which I've spoke about, and this is the act which introduces an EU-wide cybersecurity certification scheme. These documents will include scopes, requirements, and types of evaluation. If your product falls within the scope, it can be used to comply with the requirements of the EU Cyber Resilience Act to override all conformity assessment procedures. However, if you are a critical product, as stated earlier, you will need to comply with one of these cybersecurity certification schemes, providing one has been created. There's also relationships with other union legislation. So there's AI systems that are within scope of the EU AI Act will have to meet cybersecurity requirements. And if you comply with the EU CRA, you should be deemed compliant against the cybersecurity requirements set out in the AI regulation, which I believe is in Article 15 of the EU AI Act. This could be if you're classed as a high-risk AI system, such as a remote biometric identification system. There's a new machinery regulation, which will repeal the old directive in January 2027. This is to deal with state-of-the-art machinery. There's no official synergy between the legislations at the moment. However, consistency is expected in terms of how the cybersecurity risks are to be addressed and how those risks are covered by harmonised standards. So we are expecting to see synergy at standards level between the new machinery regulation and the EU Cyber Resilience Act. There's also the red delegated regulation, which I'll come to in a moment, which has just entered into force with 3 new essential requirements. And the CRA will build on the family of standards used to comply that can be used for presumption of conformity with that delegated act. And to ensure legal clarity going forward, the red delegated regulation will be amended or repealed. But on the subject of the red delegated regulation that we spoke of, we'll touch upon that as a subject because it's very prevalent to current affairs. So the red delegated regulation 2022/30 EU entered into force on the 1st of August 2025, as I'm sure many people on the webinar are familiar with. It's important to note that it retains the same scope as the red directive 2014/53 EU and the conformity assessment procedures. However, it adds mandatory cybersecurity measures to strengthen device resilience. So under Article 3, there's 3 new essential requirements of that red directive. It will only impact products that can connect to the internet or process personal data. But the 3 essential requirements are 3.3D, which essentially means that radio devices which can connect to the internet must protect the network, 3.3E, which must protect against data privacy, and essential requirement 3.3F, which is specifically aimed for products which handle financial transactions, which must protect against fraud. So just because you're in scope of red does not necessarily mean that the new cybersecurity obligations definitely apply. The Radio Equipment Directive applies broadly to all equipment capable of transmitting or receiving radio signals, regardless of their functionality beyond radio communication. So an example of something that may still be within scope might be an LTE module, which clearly connects to the internet, and it may trigger the delegated regulation cybersecurity requirements. You need to comply with potentially essential requirement 3D, 3E, and potentially 3F, depending on its intended use. However, if you're looking at a simple garage door, which only uses simple RF signals, which will be in scope of red, but it doesn't connect to the internet, the new cybersecurity rules will not apply. In terms of how we comply, we can use harmonized standards. So underneath the red directive now, the Commission has produced the EN18031 series. So that's EN18031-1, which is related to the essential requirements regarding network protection, EN18031-2, which is related to personal data and privacy protection, and EN1801-3, which is related to fraud prevention. So these harmonised standards exist. They can technically be used for presumption of conformity with the essential requirements of the RED delegated regulation. However, there are some restrictions in place. So for all three standards, it has clauses in there about password use, and devices that allow blank or unchangeable default passwords underneath these standards, as per clauses 6.2.5.1 and 6.2.5.2, lose the presumption of conformity with the RED articles and must undergo a full notified body assessment. Essentially, what the regulation is saying is what's good for compliance with the standard is not necessarily sufficient for the legislation. So if these clauses apply to your product, you must ensure that your products meet the clauses accordingly. What the EN18031 series actually does is it gives the option for the users to choose to not use any password and technically ignore the clauses if you deem them not relevant. However, if you do this, you're going to have to use a notified body. Any manufacturers using these clauses to demonstrate conformity with RED essentially must ship with a unique password and forced to use it to change it. There can be certain examples where the clauses do not apply, potentially for radio internet devices that do not have interfaces, or however, in those instances, the clauses will simply just not apply. There's also a restriction for standard EN18031-2, which is regarding personal data and privacy protection. And with this standard, it says that for certain child-orientated radio devices covered by clauses 6.1.3 to 6.1.6, you only comply with the privacy requirements in Article 3.3e if you build in specific real parental or guardian controls detailed within those clauses. In other words, really, if your radio product is child-orientated, clauses 6.1.3 through to 6.1.6 are automatically relevant. To keep the presumption of conformity via the standard, you must implement those clauses in full. If your device isn't a toy, isn't child wearable, or isn't a childcare gadget, then these clauses will not be triggered, and you can declare that accordingly. Finally, we also have a restriction in place in relation to EN18031-3, which is specific to fraud prevention. And this restriction, that EN18031-3 may be used for presumption of conformity with this essential requirement of the RED Directive, only where clause 6.2.3.4 does not apply. If it does apply, notified body must be automatically involved, since that clause alone cannot satisfy all relevant cybersecurity requirements. This clause is specific to support updates, and that simply means that if your device includes any mechanism to change or refresh its firmware or software after it leaves the factory, and if you have that mechanism, then you will fall underneath the clause of 6.2.3.4 and lose the harmonised standard shortcut. However, it's worth remembering that if a device never processes any form of payment or virtual money, you automatically fall out of scope of this standard and the relevant essential requirement. A good example might be a contactless payment terminal, which would fall in scope to requirement, and you apply this harmonised standard, and 6.2.3.4 does apply, and your device supports any update mechanisms. You need to go down the notified body assessment role. Moving on and looking for some alignment between cybersecurity legislation and data protection principles. So they both share a common goal. Both cybersecurity legislation, such as the examples that we've looked at, the PSTI, the CRA and the RED, and data protection laws, such as the GDPR, aim to protect individuals' personal data and ensure privacy is in an increasingly connected world. They interlink. Cybersecurity laws mandate secure product design to prevent unauthorized access and data breaches, while data protection laws require lawful handling and security of personal data. compliance with the cybersecurity standards and the regulations generally support meeting the core data protection principles like integrity, confidentiality, and accountability. There are examples of interlink. So the Red Delegated Regulation 3.3.E focuses on radio equipment processing personal data. This supports the GDPR's requirement for secure processing. The ETSI 3M30645, which is referenced by the PSTI, includes privacy controls aligned with the GDPR's privacy by design principles. And the EU CRA aims to ensure secure products reducing risks that lead to data breaches are subject to GDPR enforcement. And just following on from that, really, and trying to show the relationship between cybersecurity and data protection. So essentially, the UK PSTI, the EU CRA, and the Red Cyber Delegated Act all follow the GDP's core of secure data, building privacy, and minimise collection. Now, the UK PSTI doesn't directly reference personal data, but it mandates to build devices with secure by design principles, which mirrors the GDPR's Article 25's privacy by design rule. It also has the requirement to manage and report vulnerabilities in the form of a vulnerability disclosure policy, and this also aligns with the GDPR's Articles 33 to 34 breach notification duties. The EU CRA also has key essential requirements, as you can see within the table, which also align with core principles of the GDPR, including Article 5, which is principles relating to processing of personal data, and Article 32, which is the security of processing personal data. It also mandates the vulnerability disclosure policy, which once again aligns with the breach data notification duties of the GDPR. Finally, the Red Delegated Regulation reinforces the need for confidentiality and integrity of personal data. It demands data protection by design and default, which aligns with GDPR Article 25. And essentially, by following the cybersecurity personal data details, you're ticking off key GDPR boxes along the way. Finally, looking at whether processes are working. And really, as legislation is evolving at rapid speed, it's hard to gauge whether cybersecurity legislation is having its desired effect. One key theme that I've spoke about that has cropped up in more than one piece of legislation is vulnerability disclosure policies. They're a mandatory requirement underneath the UK PSTI and the EU Cyber Resilience Act. And there are findings from annual studies by security foundations which show the percentage of manufacturers that have them in place. But just a little bit of a background on a vulnerability disclosure policy. So ENISA, the European National Agency of Cybersecurity experts, define vulnerability disclosure as the process of identifying, reporting, and patching weaknesses of software, hardware, or services that can be exploited. The standardized best procedure for vulnerability disclosure is called a coordinated vulnerability disclosure policy, or a CVD. And this is what the EU Cyber Resilience Act actually mandates. And this is a process where a researcher contacts the company. The report is acknowledged by the company within a certain period, usually within 24 to 48 hours. And then the company sets about investigating and addressing the vulnerability reported. Because all the reports are security related, it's likely that a swift resolution would be necessary, and it's normally expected that reports are fixed in products within 30 to 90 days. It's usually resolved with a simple software update. However, if it's more serious, it may require a hardware fix. Techniques are also based on the international standard ISO IEC 29147. As part of the Security Foundation report that I mentioned earlier on, we can see some results and data here. So every year, the IoT Security Foundation does provide a report on global vulnerability disclosure policies in place, and it's a bit of a unique barometer for the progress that is made in the global consumer IoT market. As we can see in this slide, that nearly two-thirds of the companies that were approached didn't have a way for security researchers to contact them, and 36% nearly of the companies did have a way for security researchers to contact them. This was out of a total pool of 422 manufacturers. It's not all negative. We are seeing a positive trend as we follow through the years. But yeah, once again, fundamentally looking at the headline figure, vulnerability disclosure policies are mandatory, and we can see that two-thirds of those approached didn't have them in place. We also saw slight differences between regions, but the regions that were generally best performing were the UK, Europe, and the USA. This is consistent with where we're seeing some product cybersecurity legislation starting to take place. From a retailer perspective, the UK was performing slightly better than other regions, with some major well-known retailers within the UK had close to 90% of their products stocked with vulnerability disclosure policies in place. This may show that legislation is working because the UK PSTI became mandatory in April 2024. In terms of positives and negatives, I'm generally repeating here what I've said, but just to recapture, we're seeing an upward trend of vulnerability disclosure policies in place. Hopefully this shows that the legislation is really driving more compliance here, as it's a mandatory requirement. And we also saw some retailers appearing to be performing really well. However, the negative from the report was that hundreds of companies within the report still had no vulnerability disclosure policies in place. The report argued really that it was industry best practice and it's been standardised for years, so there should be no real excuse for not adopting it. Final negative, and I've said it as a positive, as it might be driving more compliance, but it's also a negative in the sense of UK legislation is now in force, and that's potentially lots of products that are simply on the market and non-compliant. So thanks for listening. In terms of how RINA can help as an organisation with some of your cybersecurity questions in relation to the webinar today, so we can provide technical training and high-level briefings. We can assess what cybersecurity regulatory requirements apply to your products and to your business. We can assess compliance versus standards on a clause-by-clause basis. For example, the ETSI EN 303645, which is relevant to the UK PSTI. We can assess the adequacy of your due diligence efforts. We can also assist with risk assessments. We can review technical files, declaration of conformity, statement of compliances. And finally, we can also assess vulnerability disclosure policies. Thanks very much for listening. I'll pass you back to Orla and she can take over for the questions and answers.
Brilliant. Thanks a million for that, Ashley. It was a fantastic overview, which brings us to the Q&A portion of the webinar. And as mentioned, the floor is open now. If you have any questions that you would like us to answer, please let us know using the Ask a Question widget to the left side of your screen. And we've had a few questions come in already, so we'll answer a few of them now. So the first question, Ashley, is the RED guidance makes it clear that some components, for example, RF modules and integrated circuits with capacity to receive or transmit radio signals, are in scope of RED. Would such components be in scope of the new RED cybersecurity requirements per delegated regulation EU 2022/30?
So components such as modules and integrated circuits that have the capacity to receive or transmit radio signals as standalone radio equipment continue to fall within the scope of RED, as was the case previously. This has never changed. But what has changed are the specific obligations related to cybersecurity. So these cybersecurity requirements are now in place. They only apply to the radio equipment and components that have certain functionalities. So namely those that have the capability to connect to the internet, and those that have the ability to process personal data. If they can't do this, then it's very unlikely that the cybersecurity obligations will apply. So the regulation is focusing on enhancing cybersecurity for devices with internet connectivity, or data processing capabilities. And it's not altering the fundamental scope of what constitutes as radio equipment. For example, I spoke of an LTE module or an LTE GSM module earlier on. So anything sold as a standalone component for integration into smart home devices would fall within scope of the cybersecurity requirements because it connects to the internet and potentially handles personal data. However, a basic RF transmitter module without internet connectivity or data processing capabilities would remain subject to RED, but not subject to the specific cybersecurity provisions of the delegated regulation, as it does not involve within the three essential requirements.
Excellent. The second question, and we've had a few around this topic. Seeing as the EU Cyber Resilience Act appears more onerous than the UK PSTI, would complying with the former mean you are compliant within the UK market?
So from a technical perspective, it's hard to envisage how complying with the more complex requirements of the EU Cyber Resilience Act wouldn't mean that you've not also met them three minimum security requirements identified in the UK PSTI. So from a technical perspective, yes. However, there is a time issue. The EU Cyber Resilience Act follows the tradition of products needing to apply to the legislation when they are made available on the market. So the obligations don't kick in until December 2027, as we've spoken about. So while it might be more onerous, there's more of a generous time frame for economic operators to try and familiarise themselves with the regulations. When placing products on the market or making available on the market in the UK, economic operators do not have that luxury. So for the UK PSTI, which came into force in April 2024, the UK government have confirmed that the scope of the PSTI Act includes products which are manufactured before the date and that were already in circulation in distribution channels, which technically means any product sold from the 29th of April 2024 onwards needs to satisfy the requirements of the PSTI Act. Decisions to make, particularly if they have stock in circulation or a distribution channel that needs to meet the PSTI security requirements. And now the PSTI Act applies to new or existing products. So there's a time frame difference straight away. There's also documentation differences that we spoke about. So I spoke about it earlier on, but I'll state it again. The UK PSTI will need to be accompanied by a statement of compliance, and the detail I think is in Schedule 4 of the UK PSTI regulations. But there's documentation that needs to be provided as evidence that you can comply with the UK PSTI. So you still have to take a different approach to documentation. And potentially with the PSTI Act, there may be more phases to come that cover more products over time, maybe software and more comprehensive security requirements. It may be done in line with the CRA coming into force, and there may be a possibility to agree on mutual recognition agreements as time moves by, but it's not there at the moment, so they have to be treated separately.
Great, thank you. Third question. Do you have examples where there may be products marketed for industry and business where the UK PSTI is still applicable?
Yes, the UK PSTI is aimed at consumer connectable products, but some products can still meet the definition of consumer connectable products, even if they're aimed at business. So, for example, a smart camera may be advertised to business owners, but not to consumers in the UK. And you may feel you're out of scope, but there may be a distributor selling that same camera to consumers. So the key takeaway really is if any distributor or retailer makes an identical model available to a non-professional and users in the UK, that model really is a consumer connectable product under the PSTI, even if other channels and your own product is exclusively targeting business.
Great. Okay. And then we'll do one more question and I'll leave you alone then, Ashley. As a manufacturer, when can I use an EUCC certificate for my products?
Okay. So I spoke about it earlier on. So for non-critical products underneath the EU Cyber Resilience Act, the EUCC cyber certification scheme is entirely voluntary. So you can choose to certify under an EUCC if you want an EU-wide cybersecurity label, but there's no mandatory obligations to do so. You will have to follow the processes on the ANISA website to do that, and it will be far more time-consuming and costly than going down the self-assessment route. However, for critical products which are covered by an existing EUCC protection profile, for example, smart cards, for example, the Cyber Resilience Act will require you to use that EU cybersecurity certification scheme. So in practice, that means you must go through the EU cybersecurity certification process yourself and obtain your own certificate in your own company's name. You can't rely on another vendor's certificate, even if your product is identically, technically the same as another one that's been used.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And as mentioned, any questions that we didn't get to, which is a huge amount, we've gotten a great amount of interest in this webinar, which is fantastic. We'll follow up with you directly with an answer to your question, and we'll also make the full questions list available to everyone in a guide once Ashley has had time to go through them all and do the proper research for them. But with that, I just want to thank you all for tuning in with us today. We hope you have found the presentation helpful and look forward to seeing you in our upcoming webinars. You can check out our resources section on the website to stay updated and to access our latest white papers, blogs, and webinars, both on demand and upcoming webinars. And we've plenty of upcoming content, so make sure you keep an eye out. Our next webinar, Product Compliance in Fashion and Textiles, Navigating New Rules on Labelling, Eco-Design and Environmental Claims, is scheduled for August 27th. So we hope to see you there. But with that, I just want to thank you again, Ashley, for a fantastic presentation today. And thank you all for your attention. I hope you have a great day.
Thank you very much.